Great Readings event of 2017. It is my pleasure to introduce today my father, John McPhee. I would embarrass him if I listed all of his accomplishments, but I will say that being his daughter, I am aware of the many times I have heard him called the father of literary journalism. Just this weekend, in a review of draft number 4 in the New York Times book, said of my father is perhaps the most revered nonfiction narrative journalist of our time. If you Google John McPhee, his accolades abound. But here are a few thoughts you might not find on Google. Growing up with my father, I understood that he was successful, but I didn't really get it. He lived like a hermit, didn't like to spend money, and whenever my sister Jenny and I traveled with him, which was quite often, he wasn't taking us to Rome or Paris or, God forbid, the Caribbean. Obscure national parks with names like the Atchafalaya or the Algonquin or the Allegheny River in Ohiopio, Pennsylvania. He used to chant, almost sing these names, clearly reveling in the beauty of their sound. We navigated long portages with canoes, paddled across enormous lakes with headwinds and chop. On these adventures, Jenny and I sometimes wondered if we'd survive. The musical Annie had just come out, and Jenny and I rewrote the lamenting lyrics. Some daughters are dripping with diamonds. Some daughters are dripping with pearls. Lucky us, look at what we're dripping with. Canoe trips. We also accompanied him on research trips. 2 I remember best were to the Hershey Chocolate Factory and Atlantic City. In Hershey, we had a private tour of the chocolate factory. My father with his small notebook scribbling as we watched Olympic-sized pools of undulating chocolate and machines spitting kisses onto conveyor belts. In Atlantic City, he went off one morning, leaving me and Jenny in the hotel while he interviewed someone or other for a piece called The Search for Marvin Gardens. He gave us a supply of quarters so we could entertain ourselves with the magic fingers machine that made the bed vibrate. Later, our father warned us. He was writing his epic on the geology of the United States of America, a project that lasted 20 years, created 4 volumes, ultimately collected into Annals of the Former World. Prize. The writing book spanned the second half of my childhood and beyond. I recall on more than one occasion he let Jenny and me know how challenging this project was, that he was afraid he'd taken on too many writers, he said in deep frustration. It's too difficult. He told us the average annual income of a writer was $800 a year. Whatever you do, don't write. Thus ensuring that both Jenny and I would see writing as our only possible option in life. I must add, he is always on the other end of the telephone to offer advice, to listen, to remind me that this job of writing should be hard. One thing I always saw was that he came out the other side, book after book. Now, it is also my great pleasure to turn the event over to our own Kelly McMasters, our Director of Publishing Studies and our nonfiction specialist. Please help me welcome John McPhee and Kelly McMasters.
No pressure. When I first realized that I needed to be a writer and that I needed to be a nonfiction writer, obviously John McPhee was a big part of that, unlike Martha. Today is the first day that I'm meeting him in person, so I'm just going to read a short intro from a little bit of a different perspective. And I want to just start with actually the first real writer I ever met, who was my aunt, Kathy McMasters. None of you will recognize her name unless you happen to subscribe to the Deerfield Valley News in Vermont in the 1980s, but that's sort of my point. She formed my definition of writer in many ways, and when I look back now, I realize her bylines were never part of that definition. She died young, in her 40s, and her health was compromised the last decade or so of her life. So when I think about what it means to be a writer, I see her lumbering across her gravel driveway with her oxygen tank, loading herself into her little red hatchback, headlights pointed toward the road, waiting for the snowplow to come by so she could get out to the latest story unfolding on the police scanner. Being a writer meant stacks and stacks of reporters' notebooks, drafts and drafts on yellow legal pads. It meant insatiable curiosity, the kind that kept her moving until the day she had to stop. I share these things because in order to introduce John McPhee, I could tell you about the more than 30 books he has published, averaging one every 18 months across his writing life. I could list the prizes he's won, awards and fellowships and honors, tell you about his storied time at the New Yorker magazine. His topics are so wide-ranging, and my writing group used to joke that no matter what our projects might be that we were working on, there's a McPhee for that. My personal McPhee Bibles were the Pine Barrens and the Curve of Binding Energy, though it's Travels to Georgia that I've probably reread the most and made my students read. But the book that we are here to celebrate and discuss, his most recent, draft number 4, is about the writing of all of those books and articles. It's for McPhee, and hopefully for us, to be a writer. And every time I saw my aunt gunning the gas in her hatchback, curiosity. All of his strategies on structure and language and writer's block, and there are many. This book is actually full of spirals and parabolas and all kinds of equations, but they're united by a bedrock of pure, genuine, unstoppable interest in the world around him. It's the balm that soothes the pain of writing, which is also something much of this book talks about, and I'm grateful, as a fellow insecure writer, that he showed this part of the process. In her will, my aunt gave me her copy of Zinser's On Writing Well. It has served me throughout the years and offered calm direction and a compass to get me back on track when I lost my way. I'm thrilled to now have McPhee's draft number 4 next to it on my bookshelf, and look forward to it becoming a classic that will inspire and pull along a new generation of writers who will be the better off for it, and will hopefully understand that it isn't about the byline, but the generous wonder that makes the writer. I was hoping that we could start with just talking a little bit about how this book came to be, since it is so different than your other books. It came out of essays, just a little bit of the bio, the behind the scenes of the book.
Sure. Well, some years ago, I feel a huge debt to the New Yorker's fact-checking department. I'm a factual writer, a nonfiction writer, and it rests on that. And I had an experience with one story which was about nuclear energy and so on. But there was a story in it that turned out to be a really amazing fact-checking story about the Japanese incendiary balloons that came over on the jet stream during the Second World War. And Sarah Lippincott, who fact-checked this long story, did just an amazing job finding out about a given fact that I won't go on into right now. But the point is, I wanted to write something that would enshrine Sarah's work on that particular thing, and then in general pay homage to the fact checkers that I've been working with for 45 years at that point, or whatever it was. And so I wrote a piece called Checkpoints, which started with this long anecdote about Hanford, Washington, and so on, and but then went on through all kinds of things about fact checking, and that was that was just a piece, and it ran in the New Yorker, but it gave me the notion that maybe there were other pieces in related veins about the writing process. And I'm 86 years old now. I was 84 then, or 82 or something, and I wanted to write something that described various experiences I'd had as a writer. So I went on and did 7 more of those pieces, all of which were in the New Yorker, and then have become this book. And I didn't want to finish it. I said for a long time, I don't want to publish this. I'll let it go. And because I love having those pieces to do. And I'd rather have pieces to do than finish the thing. So Joel Lockenbach, one of my former students at Princeton, said, that's easy, just call it Volume 1. So this is Volume 1, it doesn't say so.
That makes me very happy. Would you begin maybe by just reading from the opening, starting on page 3?
Sure.
Just to give us a taste.
Okay, this is the way, the first chapter in the book is called, and it begins like this. In the late 1960s, I was working in rented space on Nassau Street up a flight of stairs over Nathan Caswell Optometrist. Across the street was the main library of Princeton University. Across the hall was the Swedish Massage. Operated by an Austrian couple who were nearing retirement and had been there for decades, it was a legitimate business. They massaged everything from college football players to arthritic ancients, and they didn't give sex. This, however, was the era when massages became a sexual synonym, and most evenings, avoiding writing, looking down from my window on the passing scene, I would see men in business suits stop, hesitate, look around, and then move toward the glass door at the foot of the stairs. Eventually, the Austrian couple had to scrape the words Swedish Massage off the door and replace them with a hanging sign they removed when they went home at night. Meanwhile, the men kept arriving at the top of the stairs, where neither door was marked. When they knocked on mine, and I opened it, their faces fell dramatically as the busty Swede they expected turned into a short and bearded man. In this context, I wrote 3 related pieces that became a book called Encounters with the Archdruid. To a bulletin board, I had long since pinned a sheet of paper on which I had written in large block letters A, B, C over D. The letters represented the structure of a piece of writing, and when I put them on the wall, I had no idea what the theme would be, or who might be A or B or C, let alone the denominator D. They would be real people, certainly, and they would meet in real places, but everything else was initially abstract. That is no way to start a writing project, let me tell you.
I know often my students think that I'm crazy because I draw these nutty diagrams on the board where we take essays and treat them, we do anatomy scans on them and try and figure out what the writer is doing, when they're doing it. So we have lots of numbers involved and spirals and arcs and things like this. A lot of similar things that you have running through here. But structure is one of your hallmarks, looking at your books, at your pieces. So can you tell us, because it seems, and also it's funny that you talk about a massage parlor because structure seems very unsexy when thinking about writing.
So did the Swedes.
But maybe can you tell us why you feel structure is so important?
Well, it's important because it just informs the whole piece, but I got into it originally just being in a total swivet because I couldn't figure out how to put together a lot of miscellaneous things for a 5,000-word story that I was trying to write for Time. And what I remembered was that I worked at Time magazine before the New Yorker. What I remembered was Mrs. McPhee in Princeton High School, whom I had as an English teacher for 3 years, and who assigned a disproportionate amount of writing versus reading, and three themes a week, and week after week, and each thing had to be turned in with a structural outline of some sort. It could be a doodle, it didn't have to be Roman numeral 1, 2, 3, but you had to show, to submit with your thing what your idea of the structure of the piece was. Well, 3 years of that, every week for all year long in a school year, had implanted that in me, and that's what leaped to mind when I was having trouble with this longer piece than I'd written before. And so, for one thing, I mean, it just gets you through the story. You know when you start writing, or almost when you start writing, where you're going to end and where you're going in all the different stages in between. Because you're a nonfiction writer and your material has been collected. You know what the material is. So that's, and then, but what structure then yields is in putting it together, the juxtapositions of different sections, different parts and so on that will comment on each other only because they're A and B, and there's white space in between. And maybe you don't want to say what's in the white space, but the white space says it because these two things are right near each other. And so this is the most fascinating part of writing to me when I'm building a structure for a story.
Do you always follow your outline? So you write the outline first and then you write the piece?
Yeah, I do. I follow it. I almost never change much of anything. I mean, I've figured out where I want to go. Mr. Shawn, the editor of the New Yorker for many years, used to say, you know, your pieces seem to have about 3 endings. And I think it's the result of putting all these things together and figuring out where I wanted to go. And so there's one very important thing in addition to say to this. It sounds mechanical, getting all this together and then going through it. But what it does is just the opposite. It frees you to write. When I go into my office and try to do something like that, I know exactly what I want to do that day, what material I want to cover, and I'm hung, I'm there, I can't do anything. I know exactly where it's going. I can't fuss around. I have to do this. So I sit there for 6 or 8 hours doing nothing. And then, I mean, this is still really true. You know, it's funny, but it is also true. And anyway, then I get going. But following the structure is liberating. It liberates you to write.
Well, continuing along, you mentioned Mr. Shawn already, and you mentioned the hours of doing nothing. I wondered if we could go a little further into the book, into the section Editors and Publisher, and if you could read from page 81, that section that we talked about.
Page 81?
Yes. Starting with Mr. Shawn. Understood.
Right, on 81, Mr. Shawn. Mr. Shawn understood the disjunct kinship of creative work, every kind of creative work, and time. The most concise communication of it I've ever encountered was his response to a question I asked him just before we closed my first New Yorker profile, and he sent it off to press. After all those one-on-one sessions, one-on-one basketball, the subject was basketball. Bill Bradley, as an undergraduate player. After all, Shawn knew nothing about basketball. But he wanted to know that particular week. After all those one-on-one sessions discussing backdoor plays and the role of the left-handed comma in the architectonics of basketball, while the New Yorker magazine hurtled toward its deadlines, I finally said in wonderment, how can you afford to use so much time and go into so many things in such detail with just one writer when this whole enterprise is yours to keep together? He said, it takes as long as it takes. As a writing teacher, I have repeated that statement to 2 generations of students. If they are writers, they will never forget it.
It takes as long as it takes. I love
Takes
that.
as long as it takes. It takes 20 years or 20 days.
Has it ever taken 20 years?
And as Martha said, Annals of the Form of the World did. I got into this thing, I was going to write a talk piece about a rock outside New York City. and tell about its provenance and, da-da. And one thing led to another, and 20 years later, Annals of the Form of the World was published.
When doing the math and it averaging out to be a book every 18 months, it seems very consistent, like you said earlier, mechanical. And yet in this book, throughout the book, you show us the daily struggles. It is very organized, the way that you, when you're teaching, you don't write. When you're writing, you don't teach, things like that. And do you pronounce it K-edit?
K-edit.
K-edit?
My non-software system.
Yeah, your organizing system, everything is very methodical, and yet there's this part that you can't control that Mr. Sean talks about, that idea of it takes as long as it takes. And I wonder if that's also a kind of juxtaposition that draws you to writing because of that kind of A and B relationship of you can be completely organized and yet the magic might not happen.
Yeah, I guess so. I don't know that it draws me to writing. I mean, I just, I never wanted to be anything else, and I had this sort of thing from grade school and so on. But the contrast that you mentioned certainly makes sense, because in the end, when you are liberated by it and you're sitting there trying to work, what happens is that you're knitting words together in your head that relate to the materials you're trying to cover, and those things are much harder to define. I mean, they're just there. That's what happens. I mean, maybe it takes 5 hours to get going, but when you do get going, things start clicking along, and once in a while, it's pleasant.
I mean, something must be propelling you to keep writing for as long as you do.
How about sending daughters to college?
I guess that's pragmatic.
No, it's just if you're doing this, you just do it. I don't have the economic motivation was considerable. I mean, a New Yorker staff writer is an unsalaried freelance with a good relationship with the New Yorker, but that's going to keep you writing pieces or getting them done anyway.
But you have, in your book, you talk about times that you have experienced block, or that some of your students have experienced block. And I wondered if you could read the block section.
What's the page?
I think it's 157. Because I think as writers, we imagine that the greats, like John McPhee, do just arrive at their desks and it just comes out on the page the way that we see it. And for me, anyway, it was wonderful to hear you, or to read you speaking so frankly about it, and to give us a way around it.
Let me just say that the Joel that I alluded to earlier is the Joel in here. Block. It puts some writers down for months. It puts some writers down for life. A not always brief or minor form of it mutes all writers from the outset of every day. Dear Joel. This is just a random sample from letters written to former students in response to their howling cries as they suffer the masochistic, self-inflicted paralysis of a writer's normal routine. Dear Joel. This Joel will win huge awards and write countless books and a nationally syndicated column. But at the time of this letter, he has just been finding out that to cross the electric fence from the actual world to the writing world requires at least as much invention as the writing itself. Dear Joel, you are writing, say, about a grizzly bear. No words are forthcoming. For 6, 7, 10 hours, no words have been forthcoming. You are blocked, frustrated, in despair. You are nowhere, and that's where you've been getting. What do? You write, "Dear Mother." And then you tell your mother about the block, the frustration, the ineptitude, the despair. You insist that you are not cut out to do this kind of work. You whine, you whimper, you outline your problem, and you mention that the bear has a 55-inch waist and a neck more than 30 inches around, but could run nose to nose with Secretariat. You say the bear prefers to lie down and rest. The bear rests 14 hours a day. And you go on like that as long as you can, and then you go back and delete the "Dear Mother" and all the whimpering and whining, and just keep the bear.
Oh, I love that section. How often do you need to do that?
Do I need it? Right.
Yes.
Like that? Fairly often. I mean, whether I write "Dear Mother" or not, the thing is that there comes a time when you get so frustrated because you're not doing things, and you can't get going with what may be the 17th part of a story of 34 parts or whatever. And so you sort of just, you start flinging words at what used to be paper, and you just heave it, you chuck it out there. Bud Trillin, Calvin Trillin talks about this very thing and so on. Because if you do that, however gross and awful it is, you got something lying there on the paper that at least relates in gibberish to what you want to do, but you have something you could work on in a second draft and so forth. And that's the effect of the "Dear Joel" on me. I don't write "Dear Joel." He does.
Well, it's funny, in our last round of workshop in the class that I'm teaching right now, one of the students, before we discussed your book, turned in her workshop piece with the title Draft 38, I think it was. And yes, and it was, I thought, yes, this is a success, because the idea of exactly what you're saying is getting over the fear. At least if you have something on the page, you have something to work with. And that also, this section in particular, one part that I mean, you dedicate the book to your students, and you also, they're woven throughout this book. And I'm interested in how being a teacher and thinking about these things and worrying over strategies for other people to help other people with their writing, how does that actually reflect on your own writing and your process? Or when you stop teaching, do you close the door?
Pretty much that. I have never written a line in semester. I teach in the spring semester, not in the fall. And when I took this job, I mean, when I first did that, I was filling in for somebody who quit right before the semester. And I just automatically said, yes, I would like to do that. This was at a point when I've been writing for the New Yorker for 10 years or whatever it was. And somebody told me, oh, you know, an old teacher of mine from Massachusetts said, teachers are a dime a dozen, he said. But writers aren't. You shouldn't do this. Well, I would say to him, if he were still alive, that I can't measure this exactly, but I think I've written a good deal more as a result of teaching than not, because it's like crop rotation or something. And the point is, there's 3 months there where I'm doing something closely related to writing. It's the students writing, and we're going over at the core of the course is one-on-one conferences about every comma in a piece and so on. And when I go back in June to my own writing. I'm refreshed and ready to go and so forth. And so I kind of think that over time, I've actually done more as a result of this relationship with students.
Do you actually make them edit the Gettysburg Address?
Yeah. No, not edited, not exactly.
Or
I
green?
this exercise called greening. When I was at Time magazine, you went through the whole rigmarole of the piece you were writing, and then you came in on the last day, and somebody says green 8 or something of a piece 60 lines long. Take 8 of them out because they don't fit unless you do that. But do it with a green pencil because they know they can put it back. And so I have a greening exercise in my class, and including a piece of their own that I give them, plus about 10 things. Conrad's gone up the river was like traveling back to the earliest beginnings of the world and so on. And one of these pieces I use different pieces every year, but I also use some of the same ones. Gettysburg Address is not ungreenable. I tell them to green 2 lines or something like that. And I can't say any more about it without reciting it, but it's interesting.
Well, continuing that idea about the classroom and the way that writing and teaching can be reflexive, something that I run into in the classroom a lot is, even in personal essay writing, students often feel that they're a fraud, that they don't have the authority to write. So I like the idea of giving them the authority to green the Gettysburg Address, but a lot of times they feel like they don't have the authority to write, even about themselves, but about anything that isn't about themselves. And your work has spanned, oranges, truck driving, nuclear energy, pine barrens. It's not that you have one beat that you are steeped in, unless it's humanity, but not a topical beat. So can you read a little bit about what it feels like to write into something that you don't know and how you get to the place of knowing? And I think on 98, that section might be a good place for that.
I'm just jumping in the middle of a page. In the course of writing, you really find out what you don't know. And you read in an attempt to get it right. Nonetheless, you get it wrong, especially if you are an innumerate English major and you are writing about science. After an interview with Robert Hargraves, a Princeton geologist who grew up in South Africa, I attempted a description of Mare diatreme volcanoes, which bring carbon up from the mantle with such velocity that carbon, in its densest form, freezes as diamonds in the volcanic neck. It is journalistic custom, essentially a rule, that you don't show a manuscript to the subject. In many situations, ego is too likely to spoil the transaction, not to mention a subject's attempt to massage the text. But science, for me, is the exception that probes the rule. I have never published anything on a science that has not been vetted by the scientists involved. Robert Hargraves read about the Mare diatreme volcano and said I had it half right. A couple of days later, I returned to him with a fresh version, which he said was 3/4 right. A few days after that, I asked him to look again. This time he said, I don't see anything wrong here. I felt as if he'd awarded me a PhD. The D, perhaps, for the synonym for subpar intelligence.
When you go into these projects, what is that process like? Do you collect books and experts and articles and make tricks and then you start writing? Or do you write into it and then you figure out what you don't know and what you need to collect?
Well, I do it very much segmentally, and I urge, other students and everybody else to do that. But sometimes people keep on doing their research while they're writing, and you can see what can happen. You get a convoluted situation which tumbles forth through time, and in some instances you never finish it at all. And so I try to find a cutoff point where I've learned enough. I've been around the barn 3 times. I've been out in the field and done the reading I'm going to do, and you say, okay, that's it, because if you can keep researching anything forever, so you have to stop somewhere. But when I stop at the somewhere, the next thing is that I write a lead, and because this is a great pump priming moment, or period, or whatever. With all the knowledge of these notes that I've typed up all the notes from beginning to end, and all the rest has been in my head in miscellaneous form. If I can get together a beginning for this story that makes sense to me and feels right as the lead, the start of the piece, then turn around and look at all the notes and everything else. Once you've got that thing written and polished, that's where I want to start. That helps a great deal in making a structure, looking at all your miscellaneous notes and gradually sorting them into groups and themes and the rest of it, and until you've got your whole structure built, and then I go back to that beginning and go right on through the piece. And if that may be the process for something as short as a talk of the town piece in the New Yorker, or as long as a book.
The other morning, my 8-year-old son was asking me a question about space that I knew at some point I had known the answer to, but I didn't know the answer to at that moment. And I was sort of feeling my way around it and thinking around, trying to make my brain wake up and connect back to wherever that fact was in my brain. And he looked at me with mild contempt and said, just Google it. And I wonder, as a writer who has written deeply reported pieces pre-internet and now with this easily Googleable everything on hand now, do you find it easier to research with things like Google and the internet now, or what was sort of your sweet spot for researching where you felt confident? Do you like it, or do you not like it?
Well, I always liked being out in the field, and the research, the aspect of research was, being with a dog team in Alaska, or with a geologist in Cyprus and so forth, and learning as I go. And of course, the Google isn't with the dog, but the Google and the internet is a great beginning, but the fact checkers all, they might start there, but they don't end there, and so it's just it's a useful thing, but it hasn't changed much in. I use it all the time, but I'm getting irritated with it now because the other day I called on Google for some fact, and up came the Walmart ad as the top hit. And so I think Google's getting I want to write a piece called The Eutrophication of Google. That'll be popular with Google.
Well, speaking of the fact checkers again, you do a beautiful job in here, especially in the editors and publishers section, of showing the collaboration that goes into work. And on one thing that I hadn't thought about actually was titles. And you have a really interesting section where you talk about the title of Oranges in particular. And I wondered if you could read from 72, that process, and then talk a little bit about titles in general and why they mean so much to you, but also that push and pull of the editor relationship.
Right, and the push and pull of the editor relationship is the idea that editors have the prerogative to change, to rewrite your title for you, to knock it off and put theirs on it. And this is not, doesn't settle well with my sensibilities. But let's see. Oh, this is back. Yeah, this goes back to my very first New Yorker piece. For some reason, nerves, what else, I had forgotten to find a title before submitting the piece. Editors of every ilk seem to think that titles are their prerogative, that they can buy a piece, cut the title off the top, and lay on one of their own. When I was young, this turned my skin pink and caused horripilation. I should add that I encountered such editors almost wholly at magazines other than the New Yorker, Vogue, Holiday, the Saturday Evening Post. The title is an integral part of a piece of writing and one of the most important parts, and ought not to be written by anyone but the writer of what follows the title. Editors' habit of replacing an author's title with one of their own is like a photo of a tourist's head on the cardboard body of Mao Zedong. But the title missing on the Bill Bradley piece was my oversight. I put no title on the manuscript. Sean did. He hunted around in the text and found 6 words spoken by the subject. And when I saw the first New Yorker proof, the piece was called A Sense of Where You Are. I've been grateful for that for more than 50 years. But it did not make me any less wary of Sean. About nonfiction titles, he had a set of basic prejudices that he presented as clauses in the constitution of the magazine. The name of the subject shall not be the title, for example, even if the subject is oranges, as was the case in the second long piece I handed into him, my first as a staff writer. I called it Oranges. That was the topic. What else did anyone need to know? Mr. Sean took oranges off the top and set up a proof called Golden Lamps in a Green Night. Yes, you are not George Booth's dog. Your sight lines have converged on Sean's title. He took it from Andrew Marvell's Song of the Emigrants in Bermuda, which was quoted in the text. After I went to pieces, Mr. Sean mercifully picked them up as oranges.
As you should have, yes.
Titles, well, titles are hard to come by, and so if one comes by accident sort of early, which does happen, it's a boon and a half, because otherwise, I've spent as much as 2 weeks trying to figure out what a really appropriate title like would shine down through the piece like a flashlight and all that. And so I go to Alaska, and I spent 2.5 years making journeys up there and so forth, and up in the bush, up in the upper Yukon Valley, there's and elsewhere, the people kept saying that describing so-and-so, Jack Boone or something, and when he came into the country. She came into the country in 1974. He came into the country. This phrase is all over the place. So I knew that the title of Coming Into the Country was Coming Into the Country before I wrote a word. Now, that is really unusual. It's very often the other way around. Or the way there. But I take titles really seriously, and therefore I'm not happy when somebody. David Remnick has given up trying to. I had a couple of tiffs with him. I called something Rip Van Golfer, and he didn't like that. But it was called, he backed off. Thank heaven.
And Remnick was a student of yours, right?
Remnick was the editor of the New Yorker. He was a student of mine in 1981. And so this is a strange relationship. I mean, he's my boss. It's really fun.
He's also one of your fishing partners, isn't
He is.
Yeah, that is an interesting relationship. In terms of titles, I mean, it makes sense as a writer why you would want to have a say and feel that it is important because of that flashlight idea that directs the piece before you even enter into it. And I find in my classrooms too, a lot of times the students turn in pieces without titles, and frankly, for me, they're one of the hardest parts of the piece. Yeah, and I think that also comes from the drafting. Once you know, you have to know what you're writing about, and who you're writing to. And you talk about in frame of reference the idea of language and how important the language is, and that even a word as simple as oranges, what that could communicate about what we're about to read is important, as opposed to the Green Lanterns, or what that
Golden Lantern, Green Knight.
Yeah. I mean, that is speaking to and about what would feel to me a different piece than the one that you wrote. So I was hoping that you could read from frame of reference about a particular word that troubled you on page 115 from the beginning there, and another student's story.
115 from the start.
Yes,
And
in 2000. I think it's the beginning of the frame of reference.
It is, and the thing is, where to? That's the.
Oh, it's now to the Louvre.
It's now okay. Frame of reference is a whole piece on it, because it's so important in writing. If you allude to something, I mean, if you say New York City, people know what you're talking about. If you say Grover's Corners or something, they don't know where it is. And the thing is that you're guessing at their frame of reference, or you're reversing it and sort of teasing them in the subject. It's just very interesting because the whole structure of a frame of reference is it just runs around the edges of the piece like bulbs around a mirror or something like that. So anyway, the beginning of I did a whole piece on the topic, and this is the first few paragraphs of it. In 2000, Abe Crystal, an undergraduate from Columbia, South Carolina, was enrolled in the writing class I teach at Princeton. And one of his assignments was to compose a profile of another student whose name was Granger David. This Granger happened to be the undergraduate president of F. Scott Fitzgerald's University Cottage Club, and was as smoothly verbal and self-possessed as any of Fitzgerald's characters, including Amory Blaine of This Side of Paradise. In the profile, Abe Crystal mentioned without amplification that Granger David had sprezzatura. Sprezzatura? Of course, in this advanced age of the handheld vocabulary, everyone on earth knows what sprezzatura means. But in 2000, I had no idea, and I reached for an Italian dictionary. Nothing. I looked in another Italian dictionary. Nothing. I looked in Web 2, Webster's Unabridged New International Dictionary, 2nd edition, niente. I picked up the phone and called my daughter Martha, who has lived in Italy and co-translated John Paul II's Crossing the Threshold of Hope into English from the Vatican's Italian. Her credentials notwithstanding, Martha was no help. I tried my daughter Sarah, a professor of art and architectural history at Emory, whose specialty was Baroque Rome. Her answering machine was as helpful as Martha. That evening, I happened to attend a crowded reception at the New York Public Library with my daughter Jenny, the other translator of the Pope's book, and her husband Luca Pasaleva, who was born, raised, and educated in Florence. Hey, Luke, what is the meaning of sprezzatura? Luke, I don't know. Ask Jenny. Jenny, I don't know, but that couple over there might know. He's in the Italian consulate. Consul, ask my wife. She is literary, I am not. Signora, I'm very sorry, I have no idea. Back in Princeton next day, I had a scheduled story conference with Abe Crystal. His profile of Granger David on the desk in front of us. With my index finger touching sprezzatura, I said, Abe, what the hell is this? Abe said he had picked up the word in Castiglione's The Courtier, 1528. It means effortless grace. He said, all easy, doing something good, cool, without apparent effort. Soon after he left, I called Sarah again, and she picked up. She said Abe had it right, but the word nonchalance should be added to his definition. She said that Raphael carried the ideal of sprezzatura into painting. He painted his friend Baldassare Castiglione as the ideal courtier, the embodiment of sprezzatura. It's now in the Louvre, said Sarah.
I feel like no matter what genre people write in, language, of course, crosses those boundaries, and the importance of language. And I won't make you read it, but the next section goes on to talk about your playful love of writing and defining mustaches and the different ways that you've done that on the page. And including insincere mustache, I think was the beginning of that.
That was the start.
Yes.
My editor, Bingham, who Sean had turned me over to Bingham, and he was my editor for 16 years there. And Bingham had a mustache. And so I started describing mustaches in weird and odd ways to taunt him.
But when you're writing nonfiction in particular, it's your frame of reference becomes incredibly important because you want to make sure that you bring your reader along with you, and that you're, in many of your books, I think the beauty of it is as we read about oranges or the Pine Barrens, we're reading story, and so we don't realize that we're learning as well. And I think that the frame of reference and the way you use language is a way to sort of put the spinach in the brownie. And is that something that you consciously think about in terms of frame of reference, and even thinking back to the title, why that original title would have been wrong, about who, even though there might not be an I on the page, who the I is that's telling the story in nonfiction, and how to get the information across without feeling like a teacher and remaining in story, and how does language play a part in that?
Well, the frame of reference plays a huge part because, as I was saying, that you depend on the reader reacting to certain things, and so I'm thinking about it the whole time. I mean, one thing, there's all kinds of little things that go with it. You don't want to say, you don't want to point out the obvious to somebody. You don't want to, in effect, take hold of their lapels and say, get it. you know, should we never do. I would never do that. So there's no, you don't want to sort of have a punchline and then explain it, and that's just one little component of all of this in the selection of these things. Also, as I mentioned a while ago, that you could turn it on its head. You could deliberately. It depends on the situation, but you could deliberately get into something where you want to exploit the obscurity of something for humor or whatever. So it's something that you are sort of playing with, fiddling with, thinking about all the way through a piece of writing. And this, of course, is at the point beyond the structuring and everything else when you've put in your time just sitting there staring at the monitor.
And do you ever change the way that you write from magazine to book, or when you're writing for a different magazine? When you made that shift from Time to the New Yorker, for example, did you also shift the frame of reference you used when you were writing?
I don't know. I guess not, because I'd be thinking of things that. I mean, this is in an illustrative way. It's not based on what the research was. It's just. It's metaphors and images in trying to bring things across, and these allusions aren't to you know, it's not part of the factual stream, and so I don't think in that sense there was a change from Time to the New Yorker. But the thing, from the time I was in high school, I wanted to be related to the New Yorker, but it took till I was 31 years old for this to happen. And meanwhile, that's when I worked Time in my 20s and so on, and kept sending things to the New Yorker that they kept rejecting. But at Time, nearly all of what I did was assigned to me. As a very high percentage. I mean, I just, got the assignment and did it. Whereas the New Yorker has never given me an assignment and never suggested anything to me. And except for one or two small exceptions, which I actually didn't do anything about. Tina Brown wanted me to write about a murder in the Strait of Malacca. And I was working on my geology books, and I didn't do it. And Sean wanted me to write about basically healthcare. He wanted me to do some kind of economic analysis of costs in New York City hospitals. And I tiptoed back out of each room. And so, anyway, the Time. At the New Yorker, it's 100% stuff that I got into in the first place. But I don't think I think that the coming upon metaphors and stuff like that while you're writing, I'm pretty sure that would be a consistent stream across the two magazines, or any other magazine that I wrote for.
Before we open it up to questions, as a creative nonfiction writer, I was hoping that you would talk a little bit about why nonfiction for you. I talk about it in my classrooms as this sort of wild frontier that is just so exciting because I can't see the end of it. It's so flexible. And you do a beautiful job of writing just about what creative nonfiction is in the omission section. So I was hoping you could read from that portion, 184 to 185, and then convince us why creative nonfiction is it for you. So maybe starting with Ernest Hemingway's theory of omission.
Start with Hemingway and go over to here. Okay. This piece is called Omission, and it has to do with what we about the whole piece, all kinds of examples and things. But Ernest Hemingway's theory of omission, is what he called it, theory of omission, seems to me to be saying to writers, back off. Let the reader do the creating. To cause a reader to see in her mind's eye, an entire autumnal landscape, for example, a writer needs to deliver only a few words and images, such as corn shocks, pheasants, and an early frost. The creative writer leaves white space between chapters or segments of chapters. The creative reader silently articulates the unwritten thought that is present in the white space. Let the reader have the experience. Leave judgment in the eye of the beholder. When you are deciding what to leave out, begin with the author. If you see yourself prancing around between subject and reader, get lost. Give elbow room to the creative reader. In other words, to the extent that this is all about you, leave that out. Creative nonfiction is a term that is currently having its day. When I was in college, anyone who put those two words together would have been looked upon as a comedian or a fool. Today, creative nonfiction is the name of the college course I teach. Same college. Required to give the course a title, I named it for a quarterly edited and published by Lee Gutkin, then at the University of Pittsburgh. The title asks an obvious question. What is creative about nonfiction? It takes a whole semester to try to answer that, but here are a few points. The creativity lies in what you choose to write about, how you go about doing it, the arrangement through which you present things, the skill and the touch with which you describe people and succeed in developing them as characters, the rhythms of your prose, the integrity of the composition, the anatomy of the piece, does it get up and walk around on its own, the extent to which you see and tell the story that exists in your material, and so forth. Creative nonfiction is not making something up, but making the most of what you have. I read that. I say that every year to my students. I hope they listen.
Well, it certainly reinvigorates me, so thank you. We do have time for a few questions. If you would like to ask a question, just come up and use the microphone, please. Thank you.
Mr. McPhee, could you tell us some of the circumstances under which you were invited into the cottage in Pine Barrens and you said, come on the hell in?
Come on the hell in. That was spoken by a man named Fred Brown, and it was, I spent 6 or 8 months in 1960-something, wandering around in the New Jersey Pinelands, the Pine Barrens, so called, and I came upon this shanty where this man lived, and he lived all his life there and everything. And when I sort of knocked on the door, and this voice came out, come in, come on the hell in. And ultimately, when I came to writing this book, which is highly miscellaneous, and it's from fire towers, fire watchers, cranberry growers, people of the Pine Barrens themselves, and other aspects. And the thing that I finally settled on as a lead was the quote that you mentioned when I go to this shanty, because Fred Brown related to to at least 70% of all the different themes that went on in this miscellaneous place. It was sort of a broad canvas filled up with all kinds of people, professions, and everything. And Fred knew them all, or almost all of them. So I thought, well, that was when I spoke earlier about the importance of a lead and this, that, and everything. By writing that scene with Fred saying, come in, all the hell in, you're in the dead center of the Pine Barrens with a man who had been born there, lived there all his life, and lived in this little shanty, and And so once I had that, it resolved the problem of where was I going from there, because as I went around with Fred Brown many, many times, the different parts of the Pine Barrens and everything else, Fred's own daily existence touched on so many of these themes that I could follow that around and had a cohesive structure.
Mr. McPhee, I have two tangential questions for you. When I was an undergraduate here at Hofstra, we had a basketball coach, Butch Van Bredikoff, and then he was the basketball coach at Princeton when Bill Bradley was there. And my question is, how did it come about that you chose Bradley as a subject? That's my first question. And my second question is that when you took your family to Scotland and wrote The Crofter and the Laird, did you ever have any strange experiences with people speaking Scottish Gaelic?
Gaelic. Yeah, well, both. I mean, it's a very different thing. Butch Van Bredikoff was a pal. I mean, I knew him, you know, I even, when I was a little boy hanging around the gym, he played basketball for Princeton, and he coached, obviously there, he coached something like 3 NBA teams later and everything, and he happened to come to Princeton when Bill Bradley was a sophomore and eligible for the first time to play in those years as freshman team, you know. And so they were together for Butch's first 3 years at Princeton, and they went to the Final Four. And but my father was the basketball team's doctor, the football team's doctor. He was a sports medicine was his thing, and he called me up, as I said and told the story in the book or in a book. He said there was a basketball player at Princeton. He on the freshman team, and he was really, I should come down and see him. So I was in New York, and I went down, sat there, and I said, "Who is it?" He said, "Just watch." and it was Bill. And Bill was a remarkably versatile college basketball player, and so I got interested in him then. And it was 2 years later that I got the idea that I wanted to try to sell something to the New Yorker. And that's a whole tale in itself, because they didn't want it. They said, "We did a basketball player, just did a basketball player." And I looked that up. It was Bob Cousy 5 years earlier. Anyway, I wrote it anyway, and they took it, and that changed my life.
And what about Scottish Gaelic experience?
The Gaelic. Well, we lived on a croft. We were there for about 3 months, and the whole family and everything, and the crofter owned the croft, lived in the cottage next door. And when he grew up speaking Gaelic. They spoke Gaelic at home at over the table, and it was the very first year that English became the language of the Colonsay school. And so the transition was going on right then.
But how did you encounter people who spoke Gaelic?
Well, because he rented me the cottage and so on and so forth. And I mean, it didn't speak Gaelic to me, but I was really fascinated by the Gaelic. This island had 130 people on it. It was about 9 miles long and had 130 people, and it had at least 1,300 place names, all in Gaelic. You know, Red Archibald's, I mean, would translate to Red Archibald's Fishing Rock. And I mean, there were just these great names of, and I have a book with all of them in it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for your talk, Mr. McPhee. My question is, what are your thoughts on visual creative nonfiction, such as comics and graphic novels, especially considering the prominence of cartoons in the covers of The New Yorker, especially after Francois Mouly being creative director? And do you think that visual creative nonfiction does things differently, or maybe even expresses things better than textual creative nonfiction, or what does it lack?
Well, it's an area of nonfiction that I don't practice and I'm really not terribly familiar with. I got one the other day in the mail because one of my friends was a National Geographic photographer who was an underwater photographer, and he's the first person that ever took a picture of a narwhal and now he's got a son who lives in Texas, who writes books such as you're describing, and one of them has a narwhal on the cover, and he tells all about the history, and I read that with great pleasure. And here's a guy starting up a business in the visual thing like that, and I think it's exciting, but it's not something that I am really terribly familiar with.
Thank you.
Sure thing, thank you.
We are lucky enough to have Mr. McPhee here to sign some books that are available at the back of the room for sale. And I just wanted to thank you again both for your generosity and your curiosity.